So let's take a look now at chapter 23 and organization structure and strategy, and indeed how this fits in overall with this leadership exam. Why is structure important, and indeed how does it link to strategy in some way? So the first area really to consider is really the challenges, I guess, in relation to the current business environment and really deciding upon the structure to use. We see clearly that environmental change nowadays is happening at a pace that's nearly unbearable. And indeed outside of that, the creation, the exploitation and management of knowledge is crucial for business, and clearly that's impacted upon by the type and style of structure that is used. In addition to that, obviously, a point that we've mentioned throughout this course is the world's getting smaller. There's more competition. Markets are easily accessible. So again, structure has a role to play in relation to how you compete in the market, how flexible you are, etc. So in terms of an organization and sort of configuration according to Mintzberg, really an organization's operating configuration consists of several things, not least just the structure, but also the processes within that structure, and indeed the relationship between the myriad of particularly external stakeholders, but also internal stakeholders. So moving on from there, in terms of possible types, what are the options for business leaders today in terms of structure for businesses? Well, in some cases it will be sort of forced upon them. In other cases it's sort of choice. The simplest form, I guess, is the entrepreneurial structure, where you have, let's say, one person at the top and then the rest. So we have, in effect, the boss. It's very, very simple. The boss has the power. This is sort of akin to, Handy's power culture type, where really one person is in control and makes all the decisions. So no big hierarchy there, and probably fairly fast decision making. In terms of the advantages and disadvantages associated with that type of approach, clearly flexibility, because decisions can be made quickly. Indeed, changes can be responded to fairly quickly. It certainly does build teamwork, because in a sense there's one person at the top and then the team. And indeed, because we have one person sort of leading the way, there would certainly be a clear and indeed strong unity of direction. But the flip side, obviously, is that with one person in charge, it increases the demands on that person. That person is responsible for everything from creating the mission, vision, to driving the business towards corporate objectives, and indeed managing and indeed monitoring the achievement of those objectives while looking after all staff. In a sense, in terms of responding to change, you could flip it over and say, yeah, responsive, but it could be that it's difficult to make changes, because of the type of organization that it is. In addition to that, I guess personalities will play a part. Demotivation, is possible. If you have one person at the top, it's either you like them or you don't. So there's a stronger chance with only one person in charge, that power style culture, for demotivation. In addition to that, and in one sense linked into it, is the possibility of decision making being dysfunctional, either on the behalf of the entrepreneur or the boss, or with other people, because we have an entrepreneur who's in control of a flat structure and a number of different people. Moving from there, in terms of our next option, this will be one that's, I guess, familiar to us, the functional style structure, where we have some sort of board of directors, in effect the management, or certainly the senior management, and a set of functions underneath. These are just some examples of possible functions. And in a sense, what you have here is hierarchy. You have decisions, all decisions being made at top level by senior management, board, etc., and sent down. It's highly likely that you will have heads of each function, more than likely the directors who also sit on the board. And it may well be that below these functions you have other areas as well, particularly, for example, in relation to purchasing and therefore production, etc., etc. In terms of our next possibility, multi-divisional structure. So here what we're talking about is the same sort of thing. We have a board at the top, but really what you have is a sort of a central unit, as it were, a sort of a headquarters, in effect linked into the board, where you may have, let's say, HR, finance, etc., and that type of service. And then on top of that, you effectively have what you would call sort of autonomous entities, or indeed autonomous divisions. So we're suggesting here that these divisions are independent, and indeed they have their own functions. And in terms of head office or headquarters involvement, it would be in these areas, finance and personnel. These are just examples. There could be other areas. So in essence here, you sort of have the board managing a sort of a set of SBUs, or strategic business units. There may be 20 divisions, 50 divisions, etc. But in essence, you're replicating, aren't you? You're replicating functions across the board. That has its advantages, but also it certainly has its disadvantages as well. An advantage might be the fact that, in essence, these companies, given the fact that they have a range of functions covering all the areas that they need, they can operate independently. On the flip side of that, you've got to think about doubling up. We're doubling up, in effect, on various departments and possibly creating more work than we need to. So that's a multi-division structure. What about a matrix structure? Now, a matrix structure would be sort of, very, very common in sort of project management. The idea, let me just move down, my apologies. The idea that, let's just say that we're starting off a project and we decide on the sort of go-to structure with projects, certainly matrix, is that we're going to sort of perhaps bring in, individuals from each department into, let's say, for argument's sake, a set of projects. If it wasn't countries, let's say it was projects. So matrix, could be relevant to projects. It could be relevant to perhaps subsidiaries in different countries. But let's just say it was projects. Then what you've got here is a sort of a doubling up in one sense, haven't you? You've got sort of people coming in, let's say, to a given project. Let's say this was project A, from a variety of different areas. So there's a double up in work and double up in responsibilities. If we're talking about countries, then in effect we're talking about individuals from each department being involved in the management of that particular area for this particular subsidiary. So again, to some extent, you're talking about doubling up. So in terms of sort of possible advantages or disadvantages with a matrix structure, depending upon, let's say, whether or not it was a project, or indeed we're talking about different countries, i.e., let's say, subsidiaries, then certainly, there's increased collaboration between people. What you've got is teams or multidisciplinary teams across various disciplines being able to share their expertise. That's the main beauty of a matrix structure. In addition to that, certainly there's a great degree of flexibility, because in effect you can use a number of different dimensions. It might well be, let's say, geographic, as I've said, in relation to marketing, or possibly product dimension in relation to production activities. In terms of the sort of using a sort of a project or product as one of the dimensions, then certainly, basically, because you have a variety of possible areas of expertise involved, you can give a project what it needs at any one time, because you have that functional department or indeed a functional manager involved. So certainly several advantages, and as mentioned, in terms of project management, very often the matrix structure is seen as the sort of go-to structure. In terms of disadvantages, this is a problem, and I mentioned this from the off, really, that you have potential for conflict, it may well be that you have, let's say, the example here is the IT expert. You've got two jobs. You've got someone working within their own department and, let's say, having to work on project B as well. And that creates potential for difficulties. In addition to that, the more people you have involved, you could suggest that decision making is more of a problem, because there's going to have to be extensive discussion and negotiation. If you've got several departments involved in the decision in relation to X, if you've got to get the say-so from a number of different people, that's going to take more time. Now, in terms of the next area, let me just go back, transnational. Now, what transnational does, broadly speaking, is it sort of combines each of the above areas. It's a sort of a flexible approach. It may well be that you have a business that's operating in a number of different ways in a number of different countries. So, for example, in one particular country, it might be employing people on the ground, possibly in terms of a division style structure. In another area, perhaps it needs to be a little bit more fluid. It may be employing, let's say, a matrix style with, functional heads at head office in the home country, offering their services, perhaps online, possibly in person from time to time, to different subsidiaries. So all that transactional means is really the idea that you combine some aspects of the above, to create competences of global relevance. Okay? Let's move on to the next area, choosing a structure. So given what we said up top of the importance and indeed the interlinking between sort of structure, performance, and indeed everything else, how do you go about choosing a structure? Well, the importance of structure is many and indeed varied. Okay, in terms of how it influences people, how it influences organizations, certainly in relation to communication, absolutely, and indeed, obviously, in relation to career progression. The career progression within an organization such as, let's say, entrepreneurial will be slightly different to one involving, let's say, a company that has 50 divisions. So the sorts of factors that one needs to consider are obviously the need for control. So contrast, let's say, possibly a divisional style structure where the control is devolved from the middle out to various divisions with, let's say, a sort of a matrix style structure, or even transactional where there's a certain degree of flexibility. The level of uncertainty in the environment, in the business environment, in the industry is also important, because structures will impact upon the way that you deal with changes within the environment, whether or not they're significant or not. The importance of knowledge sharing is also relevant. Where we have a structure that is perhaps sort of matrix style, certainly there would be a high degree of knowledge sharing amongst members of different functional groups who are perhaps assisting with the development of a product in country X. So knowledge sharing is impacted upon certainly by the structure, and indeed over and above that, the rise of internationalism. There's the idea that companies, businesses are operating on a more broader geographic basis. That certainly requires a shift from perhaps the way that businesses would have structured themselves maybe 40, 50 years ago when globalization, internationalism was at its infancy. Okay? Let's move on from there to Mintzberg and his thoughts really on how a business should be structured, and indeed the considerations for business. The first thing that he talks about is to just recognize that businesses, in terms of their structure, you have to consider many different things, not just simply choosing a structure and getting on with it. He suggested, as we can see here, sort of 5 what he called mechanisms of coordination. So what he's suggesting is, with these 5 coordination mechanisms, we should consider how they impact upon and with components of an organization. So what do we mean by mechanisms of coordination? Well, for example, when we talk about things like, let's say, standardization of working processes. In other words, the extent to which, let's say, a particular process can be standardized, and indeed that process or that standardization can be documented. In addition to that, perhaps standardization of skills. For example, we have, let's say, nurses. Certainly those skills are standardized and can be replicated across a range of trainee nurses. In addition to that, when we think about sort of, coordination by mutual adjustment, to what extent can coordination occur through informal consultation? Okay? So in terms of the mechanisms, that's just 3 out of the 5. So given that, what does he mean by sort of components of the organization? In effect, what he's saying is have a consideration for these mechanisms and then link it in to these parts or components. So there's the 5. So what does he mean by these things? These words or phrases you may not have seen before. When we look at this summary here, which I've just cut and pasted from the text, you see the 5 main elements here, okay? And indeed, you see the variables here. So for example, if we talk about a very, very simple structure, according to Mintzberg, we're talking about a structure that would work quite well in a sort of a simple or indeed dynamic environment. In terms of the sort of internal factors, pretty straightforward, nothing overly complex. The key building block there is the apex, i.e. the top of the business where the management decisions come through, and indeed the key coordinating mechanism would be direct. So we're talking about a structure that's very, very straightforward, not overly complex. You've got people at the top, let's say the board, senior management, driving the business through towards its corporate objectives via direct supervision. Okay? Here, let's take a look at sort of divisionalized. Now we know what that means. We're talking about broadly sort of autonomous entities that have various functions with some sort of input or perhaps service from head office. So, again, simple, static, or even diverse, possibly in different countries. In terms of, internal factors, probably quite large, maybe in divisible tasks. Outside of that, the building block there is middle line, because if you think about it, the managers of divisions are in effect in the middle line, aren't they? Because they're being managed from above by the apex. In terms of the key coordinating mechanism, certainly the standardization of outputs, or the standardization of what is supposed to come out of that division in terms of a product or perhaps a service. Okay, so that's just a summary of a couple of elements in relation to Mintzberg. Do we need to rote learn off a model such as this, or indeed a diagram such as this? I think not. I think the most important thing in relation to Mintzberg is to understand these key building blocks, from the strategic apex all the way down to the operating core. And we've seen them elsewhere within the course. Okay? So, next area for us is sort of internal relationships. Let's look at the basic sort of concept, and indeed some sort of key buzzwords or definitions, if you will. My apologies. So, first things first, a span of control. So this is just really the number or the range, but generally the number of the subordinates that a particular individual is responsible for. Think of a set of wings, as it were. In terms of what we mean by power, clearly the ability to exert influence, the ability to exert influence over assets, people, situations, etc. Authority, obviously linked into power, the right, possibly because of the role. For example, the CFO has the authority and indeed the power to exercise influence, positive influence over people, get things done. Delegation, simply the transfer. And unfortunately, sometimes delegation isn't done well. It's either done too much or it's done in a sloppy way. Delegation is key to running particularly large businesses. Linked into that is responsibility. Okay, the responsibility always rests with the person doing the delegation. So this is the obligation to use delegated authority for a delegated purpose. So there's some sort of key definitions. Moving on from that, some key terms: decentralization and centralization. And we saw this in relation to a divisional structure. The difference between, the centralized provision of services, for example, and the fact that, broadly speaking, sort of decision making is decentralized out to various divisions. They have their own functions. So in terms of, advantages of decentralization, so pushing out decision making, several for sure. Certainly it means that senior management can concentrate on long-term strategies. For example, if we're likening it to a division-style structure, then definitely divisions are close to the action. They're close to local, as it were. So the decision-making, hopefully, will be better. It'll certainly be quicker. In addition to that, you're wrapping your knowledge around local conditions because you're pushing out authority, power, responsibility, etc., out to, let's say, a set of divisions. Outside of that, when we think about sort of, let's say, tax advantages and looking at subsidiaries as an example, it may well be that you have different subsidiaries operating in effect like SBUs or divisions in different countries. There may well be tax advantages to set up a division stroke subsidiary in a different country, so to decentralize and to make, in effect, that subsidiary autonomous, as an autonomous company, as it were. What about the advantages of centralization, i.e. the reverse? Well, control. If we centralize everything, then we can control things much more accurately, but that involves a lot of time. In addition to that, if we have centralized functions, clearly we're talking about standardization of procedures. We can offer the same level or standard of service across the board, let's say to a number of different divisions. That should lead to a reduction in costs. You remember the point that I made about divisions doubling up in terms of a variety of functions. In addition to that, let's think about the balance of power between different departments. I mean, clearly, if we have centralized functions, then obviously each function is distinct and to a large extent should be equal. Let's move on from there in terms of strategic management styles. Now, this refers specifically to running divisionalized organizations. Now, in essence, I guess what we're talking about here is the idea that we have some sort of strategic planning right at the top, where basically most functions and most decisions come from above. So this is one approach, according to Gould and Campbell, that companies could take. Basically, it's the most centralized. So decision-making, broadly speaking, at the top. In terms of a financial control style, you're talking about most decentralized. So really, broadly speaking, decision-making and broadly everything, control of finances, resources, assets, etc., within reason, is sort of devolved from the center. And in terms of strategic control, as mentioned, just a combination of these two. So a mishmash of these two styles. Let's move on from there to collaborative working. So what do we mean by collaborative working? Well, in essence, we're talking about the sort of joining up in one sense of two sort of separate entities working on a particular strategy. It's sort of akin to, in one way, joint ventures. The idea that you come together, for a period of time. So, for example, franchises, JVs, maybe even working with suppliers on a particular area or working with customers, maybe in relation to a product or a new product. Possibly even working with competitors to maybe lobby on behalf of a particular issue within an industry. Or indeed, let's say, maybe a network organization where you have a series of elements, a series of sort of separate businesses, sort of networking together to provide some end product or indeed end service. So that's collaboration, as it were. In terms of outsourcing, this will be an area that you've seen regularly throughout your ACCA studies, and indeed possibly prior to that. All that we're talking about is, an external vendor being contracted to perform some form of operation or indeed service. More often than not, the best approach here is to outsource non-core activities rather than core activities. And more often than not, the sort of emphasis or the raison d'etre behind outsourcing is cost, although it may not only be cost, but cost certainly is one of the big ones. In terms of the sort of advantages and disadvantages, well, in one sense, it's fairly straightforward. The first area here is really a reference to the idea that management can stick to what they're good at, stick to the knitting. So this frees up management, particularly when we're talking about non-core activities, to do what they're good at. The second area is, is costs. Certainly when we think about the reduction in costs, the idea of pushing a particular element of the business out to experts, it should in the long run certainly lead to some cost savings. In addition to that, I would have thought that risk management and planning, in that sense, when you're dealing with someone who is an expert in a particular area, may be easier to deal with as long as that's covered within the SLA or the service level agreement. Now, outsourcing isn't without its problems. Certainly, in essence, it may well be that this particular key resource, shouldn't be pushed out. Maybe it's core. So we wouldn't or shouldn't outsource core areas as mentioned up top. In addition to that, the idea of security. If we're involving someone in our business in some way, shape, or form, it could be that information gets leaked outside the organization. It wouldn't do if we undertook the process in-house. In addition to that, if we're in a position where perhaps we want to reverse the decision down the line, we lose contact, we lose knowledge in these areas. Tech changes over time, businesses change, and the way that processes are dealt with changes. So the longer that we leave it, the more difficult it is to, bring it back in, not just in terms of expense, but also expertise. So that's sort of outsourcing. In terms of shared services, similar area here, we're really talking about sort of the consolidation of some sort of operation or service within the business into one part, possibly accounting. We talked about services being provided by headquarters, maybe finance, etc. It could well be that we're running a divisional style organization with finance being within each of the divisions A, B, C, D. We may decide to bring that into central headquarters and provide that service across the board to all divisions. That's a shared service approach. Now, in terms of advantages and disadvantages, well, as we mentioned up top, certainly cost savings would be one of time and resources because we're eliminating duplication. In addition, when we have a dedicated unit, we should be more responsive. We should be more flexible, able to deal with problems on an easier, more regular basis. In addition to that, we're dealing with expertise in-house in one place. So one would have thought perhaps the improvement in the service is something that we would experience. In addition to that last one, the divisions, let's say, could concentrate again on what they're good at. So rather than having to deal with admin areas such as finance, they could concentrate and focus on, let's say, producing a product, selling a product, etc. The flip side of it, really, in terms of disadvantages, is certainly there would be some startup costs. You've got to employ staff. You've got to make sure you have the right expertise. There could be high amount of time involved in setting up the right level of service. Maybe you have 50 divisions and you're looking to use finance as the area that you share out. That's a big, big job. In addition to that, there's some element of loss of control over the service being shared because you've got so many avenues to share it with. In addition to that, clearly, if we're going to change from, let's say, an ordinary divisional structure where, let's say, finance is within each division, it may well be that redundancy is something that we're going to have to deal with, or possibly relocation. That's going to create problems, possibly resistance, resentment from staff. In addition to that, centralization, it would no longer be tailoring services to the needs of all users. We'd really have one function, in head office providing finance, and it may well be that different divisions require different types or different elements of that particular service, and maybe it's not easy to provide or to cater for every single division's exact requirements. Network organizations, we mentioned them up top. I mean, in essence, what we're doing is we're looking at combining autonomous firms or possibly even units that sort of act as one entity, using social mechanisms, using online meetings, using a variety of different things to coordinate control and to sort of be that one entity with a sort of an end goal in line, i.e. the production of a service or product, etc., and the selling of that service or product. Okay, so that's network organizations. What about internal partnering? Well, again, this is sort of, in one sense, links into that area of the change in the accounting function, the idea of business partnering, and in essence, what we're talking about is a sort of cooperation, and collaboration between teams and functions of an organization. For example, let's say the accounting function, rather than being known as the number crunchers who are checking us, partnering with different areas of the business, marketing, sales, etc., etc. So as we see here, a sort of a one team attitude rather than just a set of different functions. In terms of offshoring, I think we know what that is. Again, this is sort of in the same sort of vein as outsourcing. Broadly speaking, we're talking about cost. We're talking about locating offshore to avail of cost advantages. For example, call centers in India, as an example. Certainly note that as a result of a tremendous amount of offshoring over the last 20 or 30 years, wages, salaries, certainly in areas such as are tending to go up. So the cost advantages that would have been there 20, 30 years ago maybe are not quite as much. So global business services. Well, in essence here, we're talking about the idea of bringing together some sort of shared service arrangement and indeed an outsourcing arrangement, a little bit like the network organization, to form something bigger, an integrated service. So the idea that any business is a set of services, if we can find the right people to deliver these elements and combine it into one, we'll have some sort of synergistic benefit and the ability to reach out across the world in a global sense to different markets. So this really concludes chapter 23 in terms of organizational structure and indeed strategy. I hope that you found that helpful. I think in terms of embedding this particular area, I think probably looking at questions, I wouldn't say that this would be in the top sort of 10 or 12 or even 15 topics looking back at past exam questions, but nonetheless important for us. It is a chapter and a part of the syllabus, but we won't see it that regularly. So I hope you found that helpful. Good luck with your studies. Many thanks.